Well, that's an act I love to follow. That is like way too cool. That was great to see. Thank you. Thank you. So I got to thinking about Henry David Thoreau. You think about Cape Cod and you think about us being here together and trying to share this experience. And you might remember in his book that he stood on the back shore and he was looking out at the ocean and he said, you can stand here and put all of America behind you. And you know, he was a misanthrope really at heart, I think, because I think about that and I think, how much better to turn around? Because from this place, you can put all of America in front of you. And you can experience so much of what America really represents and what our hearts and our minds and our experiences comprise in this little place. I think of it like a bonsai. It's as complicated as any big thing. It's as varied, it's as intense, it has all of the facets of life that a giant redwood tree might have. And yet, it's embraceable. You can focus in on our community and our time and our place here on this little spit and see and learn and experience so much of the complexity of it all. So that's partly why I give thanks to this place. And I thought that maybe I would just tell you a little bit about my experiences here, sort of how I got here, how it shaped me, and I hope how it shapes a conversation that we all might have about our place politically, socially, personally, on the edge of this big old continent. So I got here at 13 years old. And the year was 1966. I'll do the math quick for you while you're sitting there. That makes me 69 years old. You don't have to figure it out, I'll just tell you. So nobody in my family had ever been on Cape Cod or knew anything about Cape Cod or had ever heard of Cape Cod. They were New York City folks. They had come out of Yonkers and the Bronx and made their way to Massachusetts, the first people in their family to do that, in their either side of their families to do that. And I would sit in my little room and look at the map. And I would stare at this little arm of a place. And it was called Cape Cod. You know, in later years, probably, if I was going to do my shrink analysis of myself, I think that maybe the word Cape had an intent to escape. I think there was some escape going on in my head at that time as a kid. But I really wanted to come, and I figured out how to do it, which was to get a job washing dishes at a summer camp on Cape Cod, which, for our generation, was how a lot of people wound up down here. You'd come in the summer, you'd work, whether it was, or go to a camp, go to a summer camp, which is basically what I did. And so the first trip down here, the kids and the counselors and stuff had loaded onto a bus, and we were driving from the Boston area, and we're going over the Sagamore Bridge. And one of the older counselors who you already were revering stood up, being sort of a wise guy, and said, I want everybody on the bus to know that this is the only place in the world where you can look and see both the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So everybody was young and intimidated, but I had been sitting there staring at that map for so long that in the back of the bus I just blurted out, "No way, that's not true." And I got a big, celebratory applause and made friends beginning that summer that have lasted me to today. In fact, a dozen of us are having supper together on Wednesday night. And it began my experience in this amazing little place. I went to college, I was in school, kept coming down summers, weekends, working, and landed my first job, my first real job, which was reporting for a little newspaper on Cape Cod called the Register newspaper. which was located in Yarmouth Port. This was 1976 or so, and the paper had been around for at least 150 years, one of the oldest papers in the United States. It was a weekly. And it had been a very staid paper, a lot of, school lunch reporting, a lot of ham and beans, how things were going. But over the course of history, it had also reported on the Civil War. It had reported on remarkable aspects of the national conversation, as well as the local conversation. But it was 76. So I joined 2 or 3 young reporters. I had hair down the back of my back. I had a big old beard. And I was convinced that I was going to be Woodward or Bernstein. I couldn't quite decide which one. Wearing flip-flops with sand in my shoes. And at that time, the issues that we began to explore, and we explored them seriously, were issues that really sound familiar. Development. How are we going to treat this place? The environment of this place. The healthcare of this place. Many issues that we're still, of course, working with and thinking about today. Some very similar and some very different. And I'll tell you a quick story of what Cape Cod was like at that time. Many of you will remember this. I had heard from a dear friend who was pregnant that she was going to be giving birth to her first baby at Cape Cod Hospital shortly, and had been informed that her husband would not be allowed in the delivery room. Woodward and Bernstein, right? So I go find the head of the OBGYN department at Cape Cod Hospital, and I schedule an interview, and I come in, and I say, "Doctor, my understanding is that men are not allowed in the delivery room. Is that true?" And he said, "Of course it's true." And I said, "Could you explain why?" Just baiting him, honestly, but for good reason. And this is what he said to me, which wound up on the front page of the Register newspaper. "If your wife had appendicitis and she was getting her appendix removed, would you want to be in the operating room?" So Cape Cod was a different place. And that reporting eventually led to an entire change in the OBGYN department at Cape Cod Hospital. And that physician left Cape Cod. So there was a little bit of sort of crusader there. I won a prize, a small amount of money, for some reporting I had done on nursing homes here on the Cape. And as soon as I had barely enough money to stay ahead of the game, I quit my job, which, of course, upset the folks at the paper no end. Went back up to Cambridge, where I had gone to school. Found myself a little apartment for $130 in Inman Square. Started writing, and landed a job writing anchor copy for Christopher Lydon at the 10 o'clock news on WGBH, National Public Television. Just taught me so much. And the reason I got the job was when I went in to interview the executive producer. This is what he said to me. He said, "You've been doing hard reporting in a very small town." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you understand that doing the kind of reporting that you have tried to do in a small town is much, much harder than doing that kind of reporting in Boston or New York or Washington?" And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because when you get up in the morning and you want to go get a cup of coffee, you're going to see every person who you just wrote about. There ain't no hiding. You can't go down the block and get a cup of coffee at the other donut shop. No, you're going to be in the donut shop because there's only one donut shop. And for you to do that week in and week out makes me want to hire you." This little place. This little place. So he did hire me. And I worked there, had an amazing experience, learned how to sort of make television back in the days when in order to make television, you needed a 4-person crew. You needed somebody to hold a huge camera that was like this big. There was a cord that umbilically connected the camera to a giant record deck, right? Then you needed a sound guy with a boom and all that. Of course, now here we are. We walk around with cameras this big, GoPros and stuff. But learned how to do all that and developed a relationship with the journalistic community around Boston, which allowed me to come back to the Cape. And as the technology was advancing and things like floppy disks and fax machines and stuff were starting to come along, I could begin to write and work and produce from Cape Cod and get back home, as I thought of it, work on publications here, freelance, begin to move around the world. And that's what started to happen for me. So here we are in Chatham. I was doing that kind of work, and a very dear friend of mine came up to me and he said, "Have you ever been to Haiti?" Haiti? I said, "No." He said, "I have a twin-engine plane, a little twin-engine Cessna, the same kind of planes that Cape Air flies." He said, "It's parked here at the Chatham Airport. Let's fly to Haiti." And I said, "How long would it take in a twin-engine Cessna to fly to Haiti?" He said, "Oh, it'll take at least 2 days. We'll stop about every 90 minutes or so, make sure everything's good. We'll find little airports along the way. We'll spend the night down in Florida. Then we'll go over to the Bahamas. That's the scary leg right there. And then we'll slide into Haiti." I said, "We will?" He said, "Yeah, it'll be a great experience." I said, "Okay." We flew to Haiti from Chatham. We were there for about 2 weeks. I came home, and I went into WGBH, where I was still affiliated, and I said, "I got some news for you." And they said, "What?" I said, "The government of Haiti is about to fall." Chris Blyden and the folks there looked at me and said, "You go there for 2 weeks, you're on vacation, you come home, nobody else is saying any of this. You're just telling me the government of Haiti is going to fall? Seriously?" I said, "Look, journalism is a profession. That's what I've been taught. We are like physicians. We're allowed to look at symptoms and make diagnosis. We're allowed to analyze a situation and come back, and if we have satisfied all of our journalistic requirements, we're able to make a statement. Here's my reporting. Here's what I got. That government's going down." So Chris says, "Well, what do you want me to do? Act like the magnificent Karnak?" You remember that guy, Johnny Carson, where he would, predict stuff and he would say it? He said, "What do you want me to do? Just say it's going to fall?" I mean, that's not news. You can't do that. I said, "Cut me loose for a week in Boston with the Haitian community. If I know it from being down there for 2 weeks, they have to know it. Let me report from a community that's never been reported on in Boston. Let me come back and do what I can do. Worst case, I've got some good features out of the Haitian community in Boston." They agreed. The night that the series was about to air was the night that revolution broke out in Haiti, in a city by the name of Gonaïves. And it set me up for a career in public television. I became the guy who went to places that people weren't supposed to go. So I was the first journalist back into Vietnam after the war. And did a long documentary for public television called Vietnam Present Tense that was nominated for an Emmy. And then I wound up in Cuba, Siberia, really odd, weird places, interesting, fascinating, wonderful places. And each time I did it, I was really using the experience that I built here to apply my journalistic willingness to an unusual setting, a different place. And it became a remarkably creative opportunity for me to live a life and stay here. The cameras had suddenly gotten small. I could travel around with just one other person, and we could be sort of like guerrilla TV. We could hang out in places, without being obstructionist or even obtrusive. Just be there and report and learn. And I could write. I wrote a long book about Costa Rica during the Contra War. So I was up at the border. And again, with just the ability to just move freely and take my reporting skills from here and apply them. Friends of mine started making fun of me. They said, like, oh, you have to go to all these exotic places. Why can't you find something of interest here? How come it has to be, the Contra War? How come it has to be Siberia? So my next documentary became focused in Provincetown. Spent a year in Provincetown and did a documentary called Provincetown, USA. And again, the notion of it was to use that little place to talk about American expression in all of its amazing forms. Whether it was the Pilgrims' attempt to escape persecution, whether it was the gay community's attempt to really be free to express themselves, whether it was Eugene O'Neill and the writers' movements, the artist movements, it all blended to me, and it allowed me to do that. And so all of that built a life, a creative life. So I came back and was here. The local newspaper chain at that time was the Fidelity newspaper chain, asked me to become the editor of their newspapers. So that was the Cape Codder and the Register, the reason I did it. The papers down at the other end of the Cape, there was like the Broadsider and the Courier and the Messenger, the Harwich Oracle. This was all part of a little chain of papers that was part of a bigger chain. All the independent papers had slowly been subsumed in corporate structure. And so I had to face that as a journalist and as an editor. The corporatization, I guess you'd say, of American journalism from Cape Cod. It was happening here, and I was, in some respects, in the responsible seat. So when they asked me to lay off a bunch of my staff, I quit. And a bunch of my staff did too. And a year later, because I had a non-compete, we started the Cape Cod Voice, which lasted for 7 or 8 years and was a great work of creative collaboration. And one of the really interesting things, just to keep extending this conversation about local to national and global, one day I was in my chair at the Cape Cod Voice, working away. The phone rang, and there was a fellow on the line. His name, I forget. And he said, "Hi, I'm calling you from the Village Voice in New York City." And I said, "Oh, that's good." He said, "You need to cease and desist your operation." And I said, I thought it was a joke. I really did. I thought it was one of my college buddies or something. And I said, "Why would I need to do that?" He said, "Because you're using the word voice, and that is unauthorized. And the Village Voice has a trademark on the word voice." Right? So I said, "Like hell you do. Have you ever heard of the First Amendment? I mean, there is such a thing as speech around here. And I don't think there's going to be any confusion anyhow." And he said, no, you need to stop. You'll be receiving a letter from our lawyers, and you need to desist. Change your name. Do whatever you need to do. Right? So here's the beauty of Cape Cod. Who was one of the founders of the Village Voice? Norman Mailer. 3 people founded the Village Voice way back when, Norman being one of them. Okay? He was in Provincetown. We had gotten to be friendly. So I got in the car, and I drove up to his great old brick house on Commercial Street, and I knocked on the door, and I said, "Norman, you're not going to believe this." Sat down with him, told him what happened. He was like, he looks at me, and as you would know, I know, he's sort of he was pugilistic, you might say. He was rough and tumble. And he said to me, we're going to have some fun with this. He said, this might be the best thing that's ever happened to you. I said, it's not going to be the best thing that ever happened to me, but we can have some fun with this. And quietly, and not so quietly, he orchestrated a media campaign where he started planting this fact, this cease and desist order, fact, in the Post, the Times, National Public Radio, you name it. Started writing letters under his signature, talking about how outrageous this was. And of course, the Village Voice just completely backed off. And years later, I found out that the staff went into the ownership of the Village Voice and said, if you don't stop doing this, we're all going to walk out. But again, how could that have happened had it not been for what this place is, what it represents to people, who it attracts? You know, people like Mailer, who, you know, it's just a remarkable thing. It's just, so that led me, after 7 or 8 years, that I had to, 2008, the bad boom crash of the housing market and of our community and economy. So after 7 or 8 years, I closed the Voice reluctantly. Everybody who worked there, there's a dozen full-time jobs, another dozen part-time, all got work. We sort of soft landed. I went to work at BU for a little while, and then my dear friend Dan Wolf, who some of you may know, the founder of Cape Air, who started his career, by the way, in airplane work right here in Chatham, running the Chatham Airport. He asked me if I would help him. He had decided he was going to go into politics. He wanted to make the transition from his personal life into a public life. And he felt that the airline was in good shape, and his family was in good shape, and he wanted to do it. And when somebody's willing to do that, you can't really say no. It was hard for me because, as you know now, I'm a journalist, really, at heart. But I felt like I needed to step across. And I knew that once I did, it was going to be tough to step back, given journalism's priorities and the difference between being a public official and a journalist. Helped Dan get elected, became his chief of staff, and then became his senior advisor, which meant basically that I was just like the old guy walking around without a particularly, I didn't need to be at a desk at any moment, you know. And we spent 6 years together at the State House, which was a remarkable thing because it turned my whole paradigm around. Now I was representing this place. You know, I was no longer reporting about it. But what I found was that the same things in public life applied in journalism. It was always a matter of connecting the dots. Who was connected to who and why? Who's making a decision? For whose benefit? Who gets to decide who makes the decision? For whose benefit? Follow the money, as Woodward and Bernstein used to say. Who's making money and why? And who has a right to say that and who doesn't? And so all of my journalistic training came to bear in the State House in a really interesting way. And I think we were successful. I think we really got a lot done. And when Dan finished up after 3 terms, we sort of had made a little promise to ourselves that we were going to be sort of, I guess you say, kind of in the Thomas Jefferson mode of things. He talked about how the responsibility in a democracy was to put down the plow, as he put it, leave your farm, go serve, but then be sure to go back and pick up the plow again. And don't remain a public servant, quote unquote, or official for your whole career. And that was the initial intent. And Dan took that seriously. So we stepped back out. And at that point, my dear friends who were running the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance, the Hook, asked me if I would be willing to come and help them connect the same dots, but this time from the waterfront. Help small independent family-owned fishermen, help people in our community stay in control of their own livelihoods, use that as a lever to have environmental conversations that were really important about how we protect the ocean and our communities, as well as our human communities. Work with the people at the state, at the federal level who I knew to help bridge all of these conversations. So I said, yeah, and came here to Chatham every day for years to work with this commercial fishing fleet and with the extended community of people who care about it. And it's been very satisfying work. I could do another whole sermon on that, but I'm not going to, I promise. Because I feel like I've talked long enough. But I hope what I've been able to do is just convey a sense of place, of how a place can help define a life. I suppose that's really obvious. And it left me with one more thought that I'll just sort of leave you with about how to derive satisfaction from being here, and a way to grow appreciation. I find myself thinking that every single thing that surrounds us, every single thing has its creation myth, has its story. How did this box of matches get here? Who designed the box? Where do the sticks come from? This microphone, how did it get made? Where did it get made? Who made it? How does it work? This piece of paper, my shirt, right? Everything, anything. If you were willing to really think about it as it, how did this thing get these little holes in it? And explore it and appreciate it, it just makes life really a lot more interesting. And it's, I think, a key that that Cape Cod has taught me, to not take it for granted. So I'm trying not to. And thank you very much for putting up with me and having me here. It's a great place to be on a Sunday morning. Thank you.